These are 5 draft lessons from Bloomburrow that you can apply to future formats. First, stats matter a lot. A card like Kindle Spark Duo has some really sweet abilities, but the fact that it's a 3-mana 1/3 really sinks the card from viability in most decks. Being able to attack and block and interact with your opponent's creatures with your own creatures is really important, and a 3-mana 1/3 simply doesn't get the job done. Similarly, Clifftop Lookout was playable, but pretty underwhelming because a 3-mana 1/2 had the same issue. It didn't really stop your opponent from just attacking you, and it put you in a situation where you had to play catch-up, even if it did get you a little bit of value by ramping you. On the other hand, a card like Sticky Tongue Sentinel was just a very solid play on turn 3. 3-mana 3/3 reach, could interact with flyers or ground creatures or really just do what you needed to do, and it got you a little bit of extra value in the late game if you could return something valuable, but basically just being a 3-mana 3/3 passed the bar of acceptability in terms of stats to let you put it into your deck, so that if you were on the draw and needed to have something to combat a fast start from your opponents, Sticky Tongue Sentinel would come down and impact the game. A card like Quake Tusk 4 was one of the best uncommons in the set because Reach, Trample, Haste, even though they're not complicated abilities, really do well in combat, and a 5-mana 5/5 with those abilities is really, really nice. So it's not all about complexity. Stats can really matter, especially in a quick format where you're going to be able to interact with your opponent in the early turns of the game and really try to snowball an advantage or end the game quickly. Stats matter a lot in those situations because if your creatures can't attack or block, you're going to be in trouble. The next lesson is protection tricks deserve close attention. Bloomburrow had quite a few of these. Crumb and Get It was really spectacular as a 1-mana way to win a combat and save your creature from removal. Sometimes you could do something like give your creature indestructible if your opponent was double blocking it, but a lot of the times the indestructible mode was if your opponent pointed a burn spell at it or a kill spell at it, and you just had a 1-mana way to protect your creature, which was really good because if your opponent is spending 3 or 4 mana to kill your creature, being able to save it for 1 gives you a huge tempo swing. A card like Scales of Shale was more expensive, but the indestructibility portion of this card really made it valuable in that dual mode of protecting your creatures or just winning you a big combat, kind of guaranteed. Sometimes combat tricks just give a stats boost, and in those cases they aren't always going to be on, but in the case of this sort of card, it's always going to be able to win you the combat because your creature's indestructible, and so it can't really die in combat unless your opponent interacts with it in some way, and the protection ability is really nice as well. Overprotect was a card that I thought would be mostly just +3/+3 and trample because that's good enough to win most combats, but then the hexproof and indestructible portions of the card were actually incredibly relevant because sometimes your opponent points a removal spell at your creature and you just want to be able to keep it safe, or sometimes your opponent goes for a giant quadruple block on your 6/6 vigilance trample creature and you just get to give your creature a huge amount of stats and keep it alive so that you can keep attacking with it. And so in these sorts of situations, overprotect, being able to give that protection really matters a lot, and so that's something to keep in mind going forward. But I do want to caution folks against just thinking, oh, it protects your creature, it's going to be great. Shore Up is the sort of card where +1/+1 and hexproof is nice, and it's the sort of card that was definitely playable and a card you could put in your deck, but +1/+1 doesn't give it the sort of upside of combat trick winning that the other cards do, where +2/+2 and indestructible or +2/+0 and indestructible. Hexproof alone doesn't necessarily win you isn't going to help you if you want to use it as a combat trick. So keep in mind that some cards function more on the protection side of the spectrum and some cards function more as combat trick and protection. And so the combat trick and protection portion is really an important caveat here when thinking about these cards going forward, where you want to actually be able to win the combat and use it as a combat trick or a protection spell, and so having that duality is nice. So +1/+1 can win you combat sometimes, but because it's more narrow, it isn't quite as powerful as those other options. Next lesson, some cards have very narrow homes, and this was once again emphasized in Bloomburrow. A card like Rabbit Response really only fit into the green-white deck because the other cards didn't really have the tool, the other decks didn't really go wide enough to value this sort of card highly. It even kind of spelled it out for you by saying if you control a rabbit, scry too. Now, a card like Druid of the Spade says as long as you control a token, it gets +2/+0 and trample. And this card was narrow, but it had more so 2 homes, because if you had enough food tokens lying around, it could also fit into black-green, in addition to the aforementioned green-white tokens deck. A card like Baker's Bane Duo was really, really good and worth prioritizing because it fit into all of the color combinations. You were just interested in a 2/2 that made food and could grow into the mid game in every single deck, and that was something that was very valuable and made you prioritize Baker's Bane Duo higher. And the takeaway here is that if you are doing a draft and you're trying to stay open by taking monocolored cards, you want to make sure that it is a card like Baker's Bane Duo that is actually flexible and can fit into every deck, rather than a card that is monocolored but is only going to fit into a narrow home and therefore doesn't have the flexibility bonuses that you get from taking a monocolored card early in the draft. The next lesson, the draft meta will adapt over time. The format started out with green-white being a premier deck, and of course, as people learned that, it got a little bit worse. Now, I'm not saying it became a bad deck, but it did get more drafted, so you weren't going to get as many good cards for that archetype if you moved into it. On the other end, Pond Prophet is the sort of card that early in the format I wasn't really interested in because blue-green was quite a weak archetype, because people hadn't figured out that blue was quite weak in the format. But over time, the format kind of balanced out. Blue became very open in most drafts that you played, and so if you could figure out that that color combination was open, then you would be really interested in drafting maybe a blue-green deck that had some Pond Prophets and things like that. And so that sort of self-correcting nature of draft means that you need to keep an open mind as the format progresses, and maybe cards that you weren't interested in early in the format can be cards that you are interested in later in the format. The final takeaway is learn how to play all of the archetypes, because you'll get some extra insights that can really help you out. For example, Seedpod Squire may look like it's going to be a blue-white card because it's that blue-white hybrid. It's a bird. That was an archetype that theoretically cared about birds, but it fit much nicer into red-white because the fact that you could target creatures you controlled mattered for that archetype. And so when you draft the deck a couple times and realize, oh, Seedpod Squire actually fits really nicely into this deck, that is something that you can really apply into the draft that you really care about doing well in, where you're like, okay, I've done some practice, I've done some studying maybe, or maybe I've just played the format a lot and I've learned this sort of thing. And Seedpod Squire is the sort of card that fits nicely into this deck, but maybe it trickily doesn't fit into the deck that maybe it's supposed to be intended to fit in, or something of that nature. And then a card for me was Reptilian Recruiter, because black-red was one of the better archetypes in the format, but it was an archetype that I hadn't gotten to practice with as much just because the Whims of Fate hadn't really given me those cards in my practice drafts. And then I ended up having a black-red pool in my Arena Open draft, and it was a sort of like lesson learned for me because I was not as familiar with drafting the archetype. So even if I was making correct picks, it was really tough on my confidence to be like, okay, maybe I'm not evaluating these cards correctly. And Reptilian Recruiter was one of those cards that I hadn't gotten the reps in with. And that's the sort of thing that going forward, getting some practice or just studying the archetypes more will be helpful for me personally. And I also think that it's something that's worth knowing for everybody, because knowing how to draft each archetype can give you a real edge in the fringe cases where those decks come up in the drafts that really you care about doing well in. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback, and leave hashtag #BloomLessons in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.